The crimson horizon bled into the Montana sky as Temperance Hawkins pressed a trembling hand to her swollen belly, knowing that even the vastness of the western frontier wouldn't hide her secret forever. Fort Lyon's whispers had already begun. 1878, Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory. The settlement sprawled like a crooked smile along the Arkansas River, its wooden buildings and muddy streets teeming with traders, ranchers, soldiers from the nearby military post, and the usual frontier characters seeking fortune or escape. For Temperance, it had become both sanctuary and prison. She stood at the window of the boarding house run by Mrs. Greeley, a stern widow who'd reluctantly allowed Temperance to stay on after learning of her condition, though the old woman's disapproving glances grew sharper as Temperance's belly grew rounder. The evening light caught in her copper hair as she watched townsfolk hurry home before darkness claimed the streets. "You ought to be sitting down, Miss Hawkins," came Mrs. Greeley's voice from the doorway. "In your condition." Temperance turned, forcing a polite smile. At 22, she'd learned to mask her emotions well. "I'm quite all right, Mrs. Greeley. The fresh air does me good." The landlady's eyes narrowed, taking in Temperance's simple blue dress, modified to accommodate her 6-month pregnancy. "Reverend Wilson was asking after you again. Says you've missed 3 Sunday services." "I've been unwell." The lie came easily now. Mrs. Greeley's lips pinched. "Well, folks are talking. A young, unmarried woman in your situation." "The Reverend thinks—" "I know what the Reverend thinks," Temperance interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "And I thank you for your concern." After Mrs. Greeley left, Temperance sank onto her bed, tears threatening. She'd arrived in Fort Lyon 8 months ago to teach at the town school, fresh from teachers' college back east. Her parents' death from influenza had left her alone in the world, except for distant relatives who showed little interest in her welfare. The teaching position had seemed a godsend. Then she'd met William Crawford, the charming son of the town's wealthiest cattle baron. His promises had been as empty as her heart was now after discovering her pregnancy. He denied everything before conveniently marrying the banker's daughter and leaving for Denver. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss Hawkins, telegram arrived for you." Mrs. Greeley's teenage son pushed an envelope under her door. Temperance's hands shook as she opened it. The school board's decision was final. Her services would no longer be required. Her condition had become too distracting for the children's moral education. She was to vacate her teaching position immediately. She clutched the telegram, crumpling it in her fist. Without her teaching salary, she couldn't afford Mrs. Greeley's boarding house much longer. The meager savings she'd managed to set aside wouldn't last a month. Dawn found Temperance sitting at her window, having barely slept. Today, she would have to find work, any work that would sustain her and the child growing within her. She dressed carefully in her least revealing dress and pinned her hair neatly, though nothing could disguise the swell of her belly. The morning streets of Fort Lyon bustled with activity. Wagon drivers shouted, shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and women hurried to complete errands before the day's heat set in. Temperance kept her head down, feeling eyes following her, hearing whispers behind cupped hands. The general store refused her politely. "Not looking for help right now, Miss Hawkins." The dressmaker was more blunt. "Can't have someone in your condition representing my establishment." By midday, desperation had driven her to the doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The owner, a rough-looking man named Bart Holloway, looked her up and down with an unpleasant smile. "Got plenty of pretty girls already, but in your condition." He shrugged. "Maybe after the baby comes if you're still." Appealing. Temperance fled, humiliation burning her cheeks. Only the town's laundry remained, where Chinese immigrants and destitute women labored in steaming, soap-filled tubs. The Irish proprietress, Mrs. O'Malley, at least had the decency not to mention Temperance's pregnancy. "It's backbreaking work, miss. Not suitable for someone educated like yourself. But if you're desperate—" She named a wage so low Temperance nearly wept. "I'll take it," she whispered. That evening, Temperance sat on her narrow bed, hands red and raw from lye soap and hot water, back aching from hours bent over washboards. She'd managed to hide her tears from the other women, but alone in her room, she allowed herself to weep quietly. The child within her kicked, as if in protest of her sorrow. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, stroking her belly. "I don't know what we'll do." Another knock at her door. This time it was Mrs. Greeley herself, her expression pinched. "Miss Hawkins, there's a gentleman asking for you downstairs. Says it's about work." Hope flared briefly until Mrs. Greeley added, "It's Jackson Harrington from the Hayes Ranch." The Hayes Ranch lay 15 miles outside town, one of the territory's most successful cattle operations. Its owner, Elijah Hayes, was rarely seen in town, preferring to send his foreman, Jackson Harrington, on business. Temperance had met the foreman only once, shortly after arriving in Fort Lyon. He'd come to the schoolhouse to deliver books donated by Mr. Hayes for the children. She remembered a tall man, sun-bronzed and serious, with eyes the color of a summer storm. Unlike most men, he'd looked at her face when speaking to her, not at her figure. "Tell him I'll be right down," Temperance said, hastily pinning back loose strands of her hair. Jackson Harrington stood by the boarding house parlor window, hat in hand. He turned at her entrance, and Temperance was struck again by his height and the quiet intensity in his gaze. He wore simple ranch clothes, sturdy trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a worn leather vest. His dark hair, streaked with sun at the temples, was cut short, and a thin scar traced his jawline. "Miss Hawkins," he said, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Harrington. Mrs. Greeley mentioned something about work." He cleared his throat, eyes briefly flicking to her condition before returning to her face. "Yes, madam. Mr. Hayes is looking for someone to teach his daughter. She's 12, bright but wild as a Mustang. Her mother passed some years back, and Mr. Hayes feels she needs a woman's influence and proper schooling." Temperance blinked in surprise. "And Mr. Hayes is aware of my situation." Jackson's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Hayes is concerned with finding a qualified teacher for his daughter. Your credentials are excellent. The arrangement would include room and board at the ranch house, separate quarters for you and your child when it arrives, and a fair wage." She studied him, searching for judgment or deceit and finding neither. "Why would Mr. Hayes offer this to me when the town has turned its back?" A muscle in Jackson's jaw tightened. "Mr. Hayes doesn't hold with town gossip, madam. He judges people by their character and ability." "And what do you think, Mr. Harrington?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she would ask his opinion. "I think you've been treated unjustly, Miss Hawkins, and I think Sarah Hayes could benefit greatly from your teaching." Temperance considered her options, which were painfully few. Laundry work would barely feed her, let alone a baby. The ranch would offer shelter, income, and distance from town talk, but it would also place her at the mercy of strangers, miles from anywhere. "When would Mr. Hayes expect me to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if possible. I've brought the wagon to transport you and your belongings." She raised her eyebrows. "You seem quite confident of my acceptance." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched his lips. "Not confident, madam. Hopeful." That night, Temperance packed her few possessions, clothes, books, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the small wooden box containing her parents' wedding rings. Mrs. Greeley made no attempt to hide her relief at Temperance's departure, though she did provide a basket of food for the journey for the sake of the innocent. Morning came clear and cool. Jackson Harrington arrived precisely at 8, helping Temperance into the wagon with a strong, steady hand before loading her trunk. His touch was impersonal but respectful, and he arranged a cushion behind her back without comment. As they pulled away from Fort Lyon, Temperance felt the weight of stares from shopkeepers and townspeople. Reverend Wilson stood outside his church, watching with undisguised disapproval. She held her head high, though her heart pounded painfully. Once past the town limits, Jackson broke the silence. "It's a 2-hour drive to the ranch. We'll stop halfway to rest the horses and take refreshment." The road wound through scrubby plains that gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with pines. In the distance, mountains rose, their peaks still snow-capped. The vastness of the landscape made Temperance feel small but somehow freer with each mile they traveled from Fort Lyon. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hayes?" she asked, partly from curiosity, partly to distract herself from the jolting of the wagon. "Going on 8 years now," Jackson replied, his eyes on the road. "Came west after the war. Mr. Hayes gave me a chance when others wouldn't." "The war?" She studied his profile, trying to guess his age. "Perhaps 30. Yes, madam. Served with the Union Army, 8th Illinois Cavalry." "You're from Illinois, then, originally?" "Nothing left for me there after the fighting ended." Something in his tone discouraged further questions about his past. They rode in companionable silence until Jackson pulled the wagon to a halt beside a small creek. He helped Temperance down and spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Best stretch your legs a bit," he advised. "Still have an hour's ride ahead." Grateful for the respite, Temperance walked along the creek bank, the sun warm on her face. Jackson watered the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. When he caught her watching him, he offered that same slight smile. "Mrs. Greeley packed quite a basket," he said, nodding toward the food. "Shall we?" They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. Jackson ate sparingly and with good manners that belied his rugged appearance. Temperance found herself relaxing in his presence the first time she'd felt at ease around a man since discovering her pregnancy. "Mr. Harrington," she began, "I appreciate your discretion regarding my situation, but I must ask, what has Mr. Hayes told his daughter about me?" Jackson considered her question. "Mr. Hayes explained that you're a teacher from back east who needs a place to stay while awaiting the birth of your child. Sarah didn't ask many questions beyond whether you like horses. And do you think she'll accept me?" Temperance couldn't keep the worry from her voice. "Sarah's a good girl, headstrong and too curious for her own good sometimes, but she has a kind heart." He paused. "She misses her mother something fierce. Having a woman around might do her good." As they continued their journey, the landscape changed. The Hayes Ranch spread across a verdant valley, bisected by a clear, rushing stream. Cattle grazed on lush grasses, and in the distance, horses ran in a fenced pasture. The ranch house itself stood on a gentle rise, a substantial 2-story structure built of timber and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. "It's beautiful," Temperance breathed. "Mr. Hayes has worked hard for it," Jackson said, pride evident in his voice. "Started with nothing but determination 20 years ago." As they approached, a slender girl with wild dark braids came tearing around the side of the house, followed by a barking border collie. She skidded to a halt when she saw the wagon, her face lighting up. "Jackson, you're back," she called, then her eyes landed on Temperance. Curiosity and wariness battled on her sun-browned face. "Sarah," Jackson acknowledged with a nod that didn't quite hide his affection. "This is Miss Hawkins, your new teacher." Sarah Hayes approached the wagon cautiously, studying Temperance with frank interest. "You don't look like my last tutor." He had spectacles and a beard down to here. She gestured to her chest. Jackson cleared his throat in warning. "Sarah, mind your manners." Temperance couldn't help but smile. "I assure you, Miss Hayes, while I lack both spectacles and a beard, I am quite capable of teaching." The girl's solemn expression cracked into a grin. "You can call me Sarah. Everyone does except when I'm in trouble." Her eyes dropped to Temperance's midsection. "Is it true you're having a baby?" "Sarah," Jackson's voice was sharp now. "It's all right, Mr. Harrington," Temperance said quietly, then addressed the girl directly. "Yes, Sarah, I am expecting a child in about 3 months." Sarah nodded, accepting this information without judgment. "Can you ride a horse?" The abrupt change of subject startled a laugh from Temperance. "I'm afraid not. At least, not in my current condition. I could teach you. After the baby comes." Sarah offered this magnanimously, then spun around at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Elijah Hayes stood watching them, a tall man with silver threading his dark hair and beard. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, the same deep blue as his daughter's, were keen and intelligent. "Welcome to Hayes Ranch, Miss Hawkins," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "I see you've met my daughter." "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Hayes," Temperance replied, suddenly nervous. He descended the steps with a slight limp and approached the wagon. "Jackson, help Miss Hawkins inside. Sarah, show her to the blue room. Mrs. Finch has prepared it for her." As Jackson lifted her down from the wagon, his hand strong at her waist, Temperance caught a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he quickly set her on her feet and stepped back. The Hayes home was surprisingly refined for a frontier ranch house. The main room featured comfortable furniture, well-stocked bookshelves, and a large stone fireplace. Woven rugs covered polished wood floors, and oil lamps cast a warm glow. Through an archway, Temperance glimpsed a formal dining room with a handsome table that could seat 12. Sarah led her upstairs to a pleasant corner bedroom painted a soft blue. A 4-poster bed with a patchwork quilt dominated the space, accompanied by a writing desk, wardrobe, and rocking chair. Fresh wildflowers stood in a pottery vase on the bedside table, and white curtains framed windows that overlooked the valley. "This was my mother's sewing room," Sarah explained. "Papa had it made over for you." She wandered to the window. "The room next door will be for the baby when it comes. It connects through that door." Temperance ran her hand along the smooth wood of the rocker, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Your father is very kind." Sarah shrugged. "Papa says everyone deserves a chance." She turned, studying Temperance with those direct blue eyes. "My mama died when I was 8. Fever took her." "I'm sorry," Temperance said softly. "I lost my parents last year to influenza." The girl nodded, a moment of understanding passing between them. "Mrs. Finch will bring up hot water for washing. Dinner's at 6. With that, she darted from the room, leaving Temperance to her thoughts. True to Sarah's word, an older woman with iron-gray hair appeared shortly with hot water and towels. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, greeted Temperance with brisk efficiency but kind eyes. "You rest now, Miss Hawkins." "Been a long journey for you both," she said, nodding toward Temperance's belly. "I've been through it 5 times myself, so you come to me with any troubles." Grateful, Temperance washed away the dust of travel and changed into a fresh dress. From her window, she watched the activity of the ranch cowboys driving cattle toward distant pastures, a wagon loaded with supplies arriving, Jackson Harrington conferring with Mr. Hayes near the barn. Dinner was a simple but plentiful affair of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. Sarah chattered about horses and the coyote pups she'd spotted near the creek. Mr. Hayes asked thoughtful questions about Temperance's education and teaching experience. Jackson ate quietly, contributing occasionally to the conversation but mostly observing. After Sarah was sent to bed, Mr. Hayes invited Temperance to his study, a comfortable room lined with books and maps. A desk covered in papers occupied one corner, and leather chairs were arranged near another fireplace. "I want to be clear about my expectations, Miss Hawkins," he said, once they were seated. "Sarah needs structure and education befitting a young lady, but I won't have her spirit broken. Her mother was a strong woman, and I want Sarah to grow up the same." "I understand, Mr. Hayes. I believe education should nurture curiosity, not suppress it." He nodded, satisfied. "Good. You'll have mornings for formal lessons, reading, writing, mathematics, history. Afternoons I leave to your discretion. Sarah has chores, of course, but there should be time for additional learning." They discussed salary and arrangements for after the baby's birth. Mr. Hayes was generous, offering not only wages but also assurance that Temperance could continue teaching while caring for her child. "May I ask why you've shown me such kindness?" Temperance finally ventured. "Most would consider me unsuitable." Elijah Hayes studied her for a long moment. "Miss Hawkins, I came west with nothing but the clothes on my back, made plenty of mistakes along the way, been judged harshly and judged others the same." He leaned forward. "But I learned that a person's worth isn't measured by their mistakes or misfortunes, but by how they face them. You came to Fort Lyon alone, built a reputation as a fine teacher, and when trouble found you, you held your head high. That shows character." Tears pricked Temperance's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. There's something else," he added. "Jackson spoke highly of you. He doesn't do that lightly." The mention of the foreman surprised her. "Mr. Harrington barely knows me." A small smile touched Hayes's lips. "Jackson's a good judge of character. Keeps his thoughts to himself mostly, but when he does speak up, I listen." In the days that followed, Temperance settled into life at Hayes Ranch. Sarah proved to be a bright, if sometimes reluctant, student. Mornings were spent in a small room Mr. Hayes had converted to a schoolroom, complete with a chalkboard, desk, and small library. Afternoons often found them outdoors, with Temperance incorporating natural science into their walks or history into discussions about the pioneers who had settled the territory. Jackson Harrington remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite when their paths crossed, but he seemed to keep his distance. Temperance would often see him from her window, working with horses in the corral or riding out with the ranch hands. Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit on the porch steps, whittling pieces of wood with a pocket knife, his expression distant. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Temperance was reading under a cottonwood tree while Sarah practiced her penmanship nearby. The girl had been unusually quiet and finally set down her pencil with determination. "Miss Hawkins, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Sarah." "Where is your baby's father?" The question, though anticipated, still stung. Temperance closed her book carefully. "He's gone away." Sarah frowned. "Didn't he want the baby?" "Not everyone is ready for the responsibility of a child," Temperance said carefully. "Some people make promises they don't intend to keep." The girl considered this. "That's not right." "No, it isn't." Temperance smiled sadly. "But the baby will have me, and I will love it enough for 2 parents." Sarah nodded, apparently satisfied. "Jackson says a man who runs from responsibility isn't worth the powder to blow him to kingdom come." Temperance couldn't help but laugh. "Did he now?" "When did Mr. Harrington share this wisdom?" when I asked him about your baby's father." Sarah returned to her writing, oblivious to Temperance's shock. "He said you were brave, and the man who left was a coward." That evening, Temperance encountered Jackson by the barn as she returned from a walk. He was brushing down his horse, his movements methodical and gentle with the large animal. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted him. He looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features. "Miss Hawkins, should you be walking so far in your condition? The doctor in Fort Lyon recommended regular exercise," she replied. "And it's only to the edge of the garden." He nodded, returning to his task. Temperance hesitated, then decided to speak directly. "Sarah mentioned an interesting conversation you had about my situation." Jackson's hand stilled on the brush. "Did she now?" he sighed. "That girl needs to learn discretion. She said you called me brave." He met her eyes then, his gaze steady. "You are." The simple affirmation warmed her more than it should have. Most would disagree. Most aren't worth listening to. He resumed brushing, but his rhythm had changed, becoming less fluid. "A woman facing what you're facing alone, holding her head high, that takes courage. And the baby's father." "A coward, I believe you said." A muscle ticked in Jackson's jaw. "Any man who plants a seed then refuses to tend the crop isn't worthy of respect." "A farming metaphor, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite the serious subject. He glanced at her, and for a moment, his stern expression softened. "Seems appropriate out here." As Temperance's pregnancy progressed, the summer heat intensified. July brought scorching days that left her tired and uncomfortable. Mr. Hayes insisted she rest during the hottest part of the afternoon. And Sarah, showing unexpected consideration, kept her lessons focused during the cooler mornings. Mrs. Finch fussed over Temperance's diet, preparing special teas for swelling and broths to keep up her strength. The housekeeper had become a motherly presence, offering practical advice about childbirth and infant care that both terrified and reassured Temperance. One evening, unable to sleep in the stifling heat, Temperance ventured downstairs for a glass of water. The house was quiet, Mr. Hayes having retired early and Sarah long since asleep. Through the open front door, she spotted a figure sitting on the porch steps. Jackson, his familiar silhouette outlined in moonlight. She hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. "Mind some company, Mr. Harrington?" He looked up, surprise evident in his expression, but moved over to make room on the step. "Not at all, Miss Hawkins." Temperance sat carefully, arranging her nightdress and wrapper modestly around her. The night air was blessedly cooler, and a gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "The heat," she explained. "And the baby is particularly active tonight." Jackson nodded, his eyes dropping briefly to her rounded belly before returning to the distant mountains. In his hands was a piece of wood and a small carving knife. "What are you making?" she asked, genuinely curious. He turned the wood in his hands, revealing the beginnings of a small horse. "Just passing time, helps me think." "You're quite skilled," a shrug. "My father taught me. He could make a block of wood look like anything you could imagine." It was the first personal detail he'd volunteered about his past. "Is he still in Illinois?" "No, lost him at Gettysburg." The words were matter of fact, but Temperance heard the old pain beneath them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "The war took so many." Jackson's knife resumed its careful scraping. "Changed the ones it didn't take, too." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the chorus of night insects and the gentle scrape of blade against wood. "What will you do after?" Jackson asked suddenly. "After the baby comes?" The question caught Temperance off guard. "Mr. Hayes has generously offered to let me stay on as Sarah's teacher, at least until—" she stopped, uncertain. "Until what?" she sighed. Until he decides to send her east to a proper finishing school, I suppose. Or until he marries again and a stepmother takes over her education. Jackson's expression changed subtly. Mr. Hayes has no plans to remarry. He still grieves for his wife. Even after 4 years, some loves don't fade with time. His voice had dropped lower, almost wistful. Temperance studied his profile, wondering about the life he'd led before coming west. Had there been someone he'd loved and lost? And you, Mr. Harrington, have you never thought of marriage and family? His hands stilled again. Once, a long time ago. What happened? The question slipped out before she could stop it. A sad smile touched his lips. War happened. I came back different. She'd promised to wait, but... He shrugged. Can't blame her. Man who left and man who returned weren't the same person. Impulsively, Temperance placed her hand on his arm. I'm sorry. He looked at her hand, then at her face, something unreadable in his eyes. For a moment she thought he might say more, but instead he just nodded and resumed his carving. The baby kicked then, a strong movement that made Temperance gasp and place her hand on her belly. Are you all right? Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. Yes, just another kick. Would you like to feel? The baby's quite active. She saw uncertainty cross his features, but then he set aside his carving and knife. Gently, she took his large, calloused hand and placed it against the side of her belly where the movement was strongest. For a moment, nothing happened, and then a definite kick pressed against his palm. Jackson's eyes widened in wonder. Strong little thing. Indeed. Particularly at night when I'm trying to sleep. His hand lingered a moment longer, warm through the thin fabric of her nightdress, before he withdrew it somewhat reluctantly. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For sharing that. He picked up his carving again, but his expression had softened. As July gave way to August, Temperance's mobility became more limited. Her ankles swelled in the heat, and her back ached constantly. Dr. Morrison from Fort Lyon came to examine her, pronouncing her healthy but recommending complete rest in the final weeks before the birth expected in early September. Sarah, surprisingly, became a devoted companion, reading aloud to Temperance or simply keeping her company on the porch swing during cooler evenings. The girl had a natural storytelling ability, regaling Temperance with tales of ranch life and her adventures exploring the surrounding countryside. Jackson continued to maintain a respectful distance, though Temperance often caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Their nighttime conversation on the porch had marked a shift in their relationship, not quite friendship, but a mutual understanding that felt increasingly comfortable. One stifling afternoon, Temperance was resting in her room when a soft knock came at the door. Expecting Mrs. Finch with tea, she called, "Come in." To her surprise, it was Jackson who entered, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. In his hands was a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Mr. Harrington," she said, sitting up straighter in the rocking chair. "Miss Hawkins." He hesitated. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." She gestured to the chair near the window. "Please sit." He remained standing, shifting the bundle in his hands. "I made something for the baby." He extended the package toward her. "It's not much, but—" Touched by the gesture, Temperance carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden cradle, small enough to sit beside a bed. The wood had been sanded smooth and oiled to a soft sheen, and delicate carvings of wildflowers decorated the headboard. "Mr. Harrington," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "It's beautiful." "It rocks," he demonstrated, setting it gently on the floor and showing how it moved on curved runners. "And it's portable, for when you're working with Sarah or—" He trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "You made this yourself," he nodded. "Been working on it evenings. Wanted it done before the little one arrives." Tears filled Temperance's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "I don't know what to say. Thank you seems inadequate." Jackson knelt beside the cradle, his expression earnest. "Miss Hawkins, Temperance, I know your situation is difficult, that you've had to face judgment and hardship because of." He gestured vaguely toward her belly. "But this baby deserves a proper welcome. A home." "For home," she murmured, repeating what he'd implied. "Yes." His eyes, stormy gray in the afternoon light, held her steadily. "Every child deserves that." Temperance felt something shift between them, an understanding deeper than words. In that moment, she saw not just the stern ranch foreman but a man capable of profound kindness. "Mr. Harrington, Jackson, you've shown me more decency than anyone since I learned of my condition." "Why?" He looked away, his jaw working. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control. To have people look at you and see only one moment of your life, not the whole person." She considered his words. "The war, after mostly." He stood, moving to the window. "I came back, angry, bitter. Did things I'm not proud of, drank too much, got in fights. Most folks wrote me off as another broken soldier not worth saving." "What changed, Elijah Hayes?" Jackson said simply. "Found me in a jail cell in Denver, said he needed a man who understood horses and wasn't afraid of hard work. Didn't ask about my past, just offered a future." He turned back to her. "He did for me what he's doing for you, offering a chance when others wouldn't." Temperance wiped away a tear. "And now you're extending that same kindness to me." "It's not kindness," he said quietly. "It's respect. You deserve that, Temperance. You and your child." Before she could respond, a sharp knock came at the door and Mrs. Finch entered with a tea tray. "Oh," the housekeeper stopped short, seeing Jackson. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," Jackson said quickly, stepping away from the cradle. "I was just delivering this." Mrs. Finch's eyes softened at the sight of the cradle. "Well now, isn't that fine workmanship?" She set down the tray and bent to examine it. "You've got a gift, Mr. Harrington." Jackson nodded awkwardly. "I should get back to work. Afternoon, ladies." After he left, Mrs. Finch poured tea for Temperance with a knowing look. "That man's been working on that cradle every night for weeks. Never seen him put such care into anything." "He's been very kind," Temperance said carefully. The older woman harumphed. "Kind, is it? Well, if that's what you want to call it." She handed Temperance a cup. "In my day, when a man carved a cradle for a woman's child, it meant something more than kindness." Temperance felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mrs. Finch, I'm sure Mr. Harrington was simply being considerate, generous." Mrs. Finch's eyes twinkled. "Child, I've known Jackson Harrington for 8 years. Man barely speaks 3 words together most days. Yet I've heard him ask after your health every morning and seen him watching this house like a hawk when you're unwell." "He feels sorry for me," Temperance protested weakly. "Pity looks different," the housekeeper said firmly. "What that man feels isn't pity." The conversation left Temperance unsettled. She'd been so focused on her pregnancy, on surviving the scandal and building a new life, that she hadn't considered the possibility of romantic feelings, either Jackson's or her own. The idea was both terrifying and strangely compelling. That evening at dinner, she found herself hyper-aware of Jackson's presence at the table. He'd taken to joining the family meals more regularly, at Mr. Hayes's insistence. Temperance noticed things she'd overlooked before, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when Sarah told an amusing story, the careful way he cut his food, the deep timbre of his voice when he spoke. As August progressed, the heat became more oppressive. Temperance's discomfort increased, and Dr. Morrison's visits became more frequent. The baby had dropped lower, he explained, a sign that birth might come sooner than expected. One particularly hot afternoon, Temperance was napping when she was awakened by a sharp pain across her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her belly as the sensation intensified, then gradually faded. Uncertain, she waited, counting minutes until another pain seized her. "Mrs. Finch," she called, fear lacing her voice. The housekeeper appeared almost immediately, took one look at Temperance's face and understood. "Is it time, then?" "I think so. The pains are about 10 minutes apart." Mrs. Finch nodded briskly. "I'll send for Dr. Morrison and get things ready. You just breathe, dear." Women have been doing this since Eve. The next hours passed in a blur of increasing pain and determined preparation. Sarah was sent to stay with the cook's family in the bunkhouse. Mr. Hayes paced the downstairs hallway while Mrs. Finch transformed Temperance's bedroom into a birthing room, layering the bed with old sheets, setting out clean linens and a basin of water, positioning the oil lamps for maximum light. Jackson had been sent to fetch the doctor from Fort Lyon, a trip that would take hours, even riding hard. As dusk fell and Temperance's labor intensified, Mrs. Finch grew concerned. "Baby's coming faster than I expected," she muttered, checking Temperance's progress. "Might not wait for the doctor." Temperance gripped the older woman's hand. "Can you deliver it? Done it before, Mrs. Finch assured her. "5 of my own and helped with plenty others, but first babies can be tricky." The night deepened as Temperance's pain worsened. She tried to remain quiet, but as the contractions grew stronger and closer together, her cries echoed through the house. Through the haze of pain, she heard the pounding of hoofbeats in the yard, followed by hurried footsteps on the stairs. Dr. Morrison entered, looking harried but composed, with Jackson right behind him carrying the doctor's bag. The foreman's eyes found Temperance's, full of concern. "You made good time," Mrs. Finch said to the doctor, relief evident in her voice. "Rode like the devil was on our heels," Dr. Morrison replied, washing his hands in the basin. "Mr. Harrington here nearly killed his horse getting to me." Jackson remained at the doorway, his face pale beneath his tan. "Is she going to be all right?" "She'll be fine," the doctor assured him. "But I need you to wait downstairs. This is no place for men." Temperance, in the grip of another contraction, reached out blindly. "Jackson," she gasped. He was at her side in an instant, taking her hand. "I'm here. Stay," she whispered. "Please." Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Finch exchanged glances. "It's not proper," the doctor began. "Hang proper," Jackson said fiercely. "If she wants me here, I'm staying." And stay he did, through the long hours that followed. He held Temperance's hand through contractions that left her sobbing, wiped her brow with cool cloths, and murmured encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. When Dr. Morrison instructed her to push, Jackson supported her shoulders, his strength unwavering. As dawn broke over the mountains, Temperance's child entered the world with a lusty cry. "A boy," Dr. Morrison announced, "healthy and strong." Mrs. Finch quickly cleaned and swaddled the infant while the doctor attended to Temperance. When the baby was placed in her arms, exhaustion gave way to wonder. Tiny fingers, a shock of dark hair, eyes squeezed shut against the new world, he was perfect. "Look what you did," Jackson whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He sat on the edge of the bed, one arm still supporting Temperance's shoulders, gazing at the child in awe. "Thank you," she murmured, leaning against him, "for staying." His eyes, when they met hers, held something she'd never seen before, a tenderness so profound it made her breath catch. "Always," he said simply. Later, after Temperance and the baby had been cleaned up and made comfortable, Jackson returned with the cradle he'd carved, placing it gently beside her bed. "Does he have a name?" he asked, watching as the infant slept in Temperance's arms. She nodded. "Thomas, after my father." She hesitated. "Thomas Jackson Hawkins." Jackson's head jerked up, surprise evident in his expression. "You're naming him after me, if that's all right," Temperance said softly. "You've shown him more care than his own father ever did. You were here when he came into this world." Something shifted in Jackson's face, a lowering of defenses, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice thick. The days following Thomas's birth brought a new rhythm to life at Hayes Ranch. Mr. Hayes proved to be a doting surrogate grandfather, often holding the baby while conducting ranch business from his study. Sarah was initially uncertain around the tiny infant, but soon appointed herself his official protector and storyteller. Mrs. Finch took charge of teaching Temperance the practical aspects of motherhood, how to bathe the baby, the best way to swaddle him, remedies for colic and diaper rash. The housekeeper's matter-of-fact approach was reassuring, helping Temperance overcome her fears of inadequacy. And Jackson was a constant, steady presence. He seemed to find reasons to visit the house more frequently, bringing wildflowers for Temperance's bedside table or small carved animals that would one day become Thomas's toys. In the evenings, he often sat with Temperance on the porch, sometimes holding Thomas while she rested. 2 weeks after the birth, on a cool September evening, Temperance joined Jackson on the porch steps. Thomas was asleep upstairs, watched over by Mrs. Finch, who had insisted Temperance take some time for herself. "You look better," Jackson observed. "Less tired," she smiled. "He slept for 4 hours straight last night. Mrs. Finch says it's a miracle." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the setting sun painted the mountains gold and crimson. Temperance was acutely aware of Jackson beside her, his warmth, the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. "I received a letter today," she said finally. "From the school board in Fort Lyon." Jackson tensed beside her. "What did they want?" "To offer me my position back. Apparently, several parents have complained about my replacement." She couldn't keep the satisfaction from her voice. "They're willing to overlook my indiscretion given my exceptional teaching abilities. Are you considering it?" His voice was carefully neutral. Temperance studied his profile. "Would you advise me to?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "No," he said finally. "But it's not my place to advise you." "Why not?" Jackson turned to face her fully. "Because I'm not objective, Temperance. I want you to stay here at the ranch." He took a deep breath. "With me," her heart stuttered. "Jackson, I know it's too soon," he continued quickly. "You've just had a child. You're still recovering. And I have nothing to offer except myself, which isn't much." "It's everything," she interrupted, her voice soft but firm. He stared at her, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. "These past months," Temperance continued, "you've shown me kindness when others showed judgment, respect when others offered scorn." She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "You carved a cradle for a child not your own and said it was for home. You stayed with me through the darkest hours of my life and held my son minutes after he was born." "Temperance," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not going back to Fort Lyon," she said. "My home is here now, with Thomas, and if you'll have us with you." Jackson's hand tightened on hers. "If I'll have you." He shook his head in wonder. "Temperance Hawkins, I've been falling in love with you since the day I brought you here. Even though I was carrying another man's child, that child is yours," he said firmly. "And you are the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known." He reached up to touch her cheek gently. "I love Thomas already, would be proud to raise him as my own if you'd allow it." Tears filled her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "I think I've been falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I just didn't recognize it until recently." Jackson smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "May I kiss you, Temperance? I've been wanting to for months." In answer, she leaned forward, meeting his lips with her own. The kiss was gentle at first, tender with new discovery, then deepened as his hand cupped the back of her head. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I should speak to Mr. Hayes," Jackson said, resting his forehead against hers. "Ask his permission to court you properly." Temperance laughed softly. "I think he might suspect your intentions already. Mrs. Finch certainly does." "Nothing gets past that woman," Jackson agreed with a chuckle. The sound of Thomas crying drifted through the open window above them. Temperance sighed. "Duty calls." Jackson stood, helping her to her feet. "Go to him. I'll be here when you're done. Promise?" His eyes, clear and certain in the fading light, held hers. "Promise." Fall painted the Colorado landscape in brilliant hues of gold and crimson as Temperance and Jackson's courtship progressed. Mr. Hayes, when approached formally by his foreman, had merely grinned and said, "About time you figured it out, son." Sarah was delighted by the development, confiding to Temperance that she'd known all along Mr. Jackson was sweet on you. The girl had taken to calling Thomas her almost brother, a term that made Jackson's eyes crinkle with pleasure. As November's chill settled over the ranch, Jackson began construction on a small house about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, close enough for Temperance to continue teaching Sarah, but offering privacy for the family they hoped to build together. He worked on it evenings and Sundays, often joined by other ranch hands who volunteered their time. Temperance visited the site regularly, Thomas bundled against the cold in her arms, watching as walls rose and a roof took shape. The house was modest but well-designed, with large windows to capture the mountain views, a spacious kitchen, and 3 bedrooms. "3?" she'd questioned when Jackson showed her the plans. He'd smiled, a hint of shyness in his expression. "One for us, one for Thomas, and one for Hopes." The meaning behind his words had warmed her heart. They hadn't discussed marriage directly yet, but it hovered in the air between them, an unspoken promise waiting for the right moment. That moment came on Christmas Eve. The ranch house was festooned with pine boughs and red ribbons, a large tree dominating the main room, decorated with paper stars Sarah had made and strings of cranberries and popcorn. A fire roared in the hearth, and Mrs. Finch had outdone herself with a feast that left everyone pleasantly stuffed. Thomas, now nearly 4 months old and growing rapidly, had been passed from lap to lap throughout the evening, cooed over and bounced until he finally fell asleep in Mr. Hayes's arms. The older man had looked so content holding the sleeping infant that no one had the heart to disturb them. As the evening wore on, Sarah was sent reluctantly to bed, extracting promises that no presents would be opened until she was awake. Mrs. Finch retired to her room, and Mr. Hayes, after carefully transferring Thomas to Temperance, excused himself with a meaningful glance at Jackson. Left alone in the main room, with only the firelight and the glow from the Christmas tree illuminating the space, Temperance felt a flutter of anticipation. Jackson sat beside her on the sofa, one arm draped casually along the back, his fingers occasionally brushing her shoulder. "Thomas is getting heavier," she observed, adjusting the sleeping baby in her arms. Jackson nodded, his expression soft as he looked at the child. "Growing strong, has your eyes, and his father's dark hair, unfortunately." "Nothing unfortunate about it," Jackson countered. "He's perfect, Temperance, just as he is." She leaned against him, grateful for his unfailing acceptance of her son. "The house is coming along beautifully. Will it be ready by spring, sooner if the weather holds?" He hesitated. "There's something I wanted to ask you about the house, about us." Temperance's heart quickened. "Yes." Jackson shifted, reaching into his pocket. "I had planned a speech, had it all worked out in my head." He smiled ruefully. but now I can't remember a word of it. You don't need a speech, she said softly. He withdrew a small wooden box from his pocket, carved with the same delicate wildflowers that adorned Thomas's cradle. I made this too, he said, opening it to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a small pearl. It was my mother's. I've carried it with me since I left home, waiting for. He met her eyes. Waiting for you, though I didn't know it. Temperance's breath caught as Jackson slid from the sofa to one knee before her. Temperance Hawkins, you and Thomas have become my world. I love you both more than I thought possible. His voice was steady, though emotion made his eyes bright. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Let me be a father to Thomas and, God willing, more children in the years to come. Tears of joy spilled down Temperance's cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Jackson, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby between them. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. Mrs. Harrington, Jackson said, testing the sound of it, has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Temperance laughed softly. It does indeed, Mr. Harrington. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the Hayes Ranch main room, decorated with evergreen boughs and white ribbons. Reverend Wilson from Fort Lyon performed the ceremony, his initial reluctance overcome by Mr. Hayes's considerable influence and Jackson's unwavering stare. Temperance wore a simple ivory dress sewn by Mrs. Finch, with Sarah as her maid of honor, proudly holding a sleeping Thomas throughout the service. The gossips of Fort Lyon had a field day, of course. A fallen schoolteacher marrying a ranch foreman barely 4 months after giving birth to another man's child. Scandalous. But within the protective circle of the Hayes Ranch, surrounded by people who had become family, Temperance found she no longer cared what others thought. Their new home was ready by February, a warm haven against the winter winds that swept down from the mountains. Jackson had built furniture for each room, a large bed with a carved headboard for their bedroom, a sturdy table and chairs for the kitchen, bookshelves for Temperance's growing collection, and a rocking chair placed strategically near the hearth. In the second bedroom, Thomas's cradle had been replaced with a crib, also carved by Jackson's hands. Above it hung a mobile of wooden animals, horses, cattle, deer, and rabbits that spun gently in the draft from the window, delighting the baby with their movement. The third bedroom, the room for hopes, remained empty but ready, freshly painted and waiting. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings, Temperance walked to the main house with Thomas to teach Sarah, while Jackson oversaw the ranch operations. Afternoons often found them together, with Jackson teaching Temperance to ride. She proved a natural once she overcame her initial fears, or Temperance reading aloud while Jackson worked on new carvings. Evenings were their favorite time. Thomas bathed and put to bed, a fire crackling in the hearth, the two of them talking about their day or simply sitting in companionable silence, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. It was during one such evening in late April that Temperance shared her suspicion. "Jackson," she said, looking up from her mending, "I think the third bedroom might be needed sooner than we expected." He glanced up from the book he'd been reading, confusion crossing his features before understanding dawned. "Are you saying?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting a child in November." Jackson was across the room in an instant, gathering her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "A baby," he breathed, setting her down gently. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his joy was evident. Happy doesn't begin to describe it. He placed a hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "A brother or sister for Thomas, a child we created together. The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Thomas took his first steps, tottering from Temperance to Jackson with delighted squeals, and spoke his first words "Mama" and "Papa" in quick succession, the latter bringing tears to Jackson's eyes. Sarah, now 13, had blossomed under Temperance's tutelage. Mr. Hayes had decided against sending her east, seeing how she thrived in the combination of formal education and practical ranch life. The girl spent hours with Thomas, teaching him games and songs, and spoke excitedly to Temperance's growing belly about being a big sister again. November 15, 1879, brought the arrival of Elijah James Harrington, named for the man who had given both his parents a second chance at life. Unlike Thomas's difficult birth, Elijah came quickly and easily, with Mrs. Finch and Dr. Morrison attending and Jackson once again refusing to leave Temperance's side. When Jackson held his son for the first time, this child with his gray eyes and Temperance's copper hair, the emotion on his face was beyond words. He placed the baby gently in the cradle he'd carved months before, then sat beside Temperance on the bed, gathering both her and Thomas, who had been brought in to meet his brother, into his arms. "Look at us," he whispered, his voice thick. "A family, our family." Temperance leaned against him, overwhelmed with gratitude and joy. "From such unlikely beginnings," she murmured. "The best stories often have rocky starts," Jackson replied, kissing her temple. "Makes the happy endings all the sweeter." As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, the Harrington home stood warm against the snow, a haven of love built from courage and second chances. Inside, a cradle rocked gently by the fire, crafted by a father's hands and filled with the promise of tomorrow. Outside, the Wild West continued its relentless evolution. Railroads pushed further across the territory, new settlements sprouted along rivers and valleys, and the old ways gradually gave way to progress. But within the circles of family, both the one born of blood and the one created by choice, some things remained timeless. The strength found in acceptance, the healing power of love, and the profound truth that home isn't always where you begin, but where you finally belong. In the years that followed, the Harrington family grew and flourished. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's intelligence and a talent for storytelling. Elijah inherited his father's way with horses and quiet strength. They were joined by a sister, Margaret Rose, in 1882, who combined her mother's determination with her father's steady patience. Temperance eventually opened a small school on the Hayes Ranch, teaching not only Sarah and her own children, but also the children of other ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. Jackson continued as foreman, eventually becoming a partner in the ranch when Elijah Hayes began to step back from daily operations. The little house expanded with their growing family, a new wing added here, a larger kitchen there. But the heart of it remained unchanged. The cradle Jackson had carved in that first summer, passed down from child to child, a symbol of the home he'd promised and delivered. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work done, Temperance and Jackson would sometimes sit on their porch, looking out at the mountains, and the ranch spread before them, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest, marveling at how far they'd come from that day he'd driven a wagon to Fort Lyon to fetch a scandalized schoolteacher. "For home," he would sometimes murmur, echoing the words he'd spoken while presenting the cradle so many years before, and Temperance would smile, knowing they'd found exactly that, not just a place, but a feeling, a belonging, a love that had transformed two broken paths into one journey, continuing forward together, stronger for having weathered the storms.